Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
The first time they met, though they didn't know it, was at the Immortal Hour, a play with few people watching at King's Cross. Christopher and Catherine both went there often, and because there were so few people, they soon recognized each other and started to smile and nod when they saw one another. Catherine noticed Christopher for the first time on her fifth visit. She overheard two people talking behind her, and one of them proudly said, "This is my 11th time," while the other casually replied, "This is my 32nd." The first person was surprised, and Catherine couldn't help but turn around to see. That's when she first saw Christopher, and he saw her too. They continued to notice each other at the next three performances. On her 9th visit and his 36th, they found themselves sitting only 6 seats apart. Between the scenes of the first act, he moved closer to her, and by the end of the act, he boldly sat beside her. She smiled at him, a nice smile. "It's so beautiful," he said, feeling a bit sorry for interrupting her. "Perfectly beautiful," she replied. "This is my 9th time." "And this is my 36th, he said. "I know," she said. "How do you know?" he asked. "Because I heard you say it was your 32nd time, and I've been keeping track since then." So they became friends, and Christopher thought she had the sweetest smile and a funny little voice. She was small, always wearing the same little hat. She hardly ever had to take it off, because there was hardly ever anyone behind her. Even in a big hat, she didn't block anyone's view. She always wore the same clothes too, although they were pretty. Christopher thought she might not have a lot of money because she always wore the same things. He also thought she might be a bit older than him, just a little older, but that didn't seem important. One night, he started to feel like she might be married, and he didn't like that feeling at all. He wondered if he was falling in love with her, even though he didn't even know her name. It was her 14th visit and his 48th, and he found himself going to the play more often just to see her. He couldn't figure out why he felt this way, but there was something about her that made him uneasy. He couldn't explain it, whether it was her round figure, the way she talked, or her calmness. Maybe it was the way she seemed so confident, like she could make friends with anyone and then leave them whenever she wanted. But maybe he was wrong. She was always by herself. If she had a husband, he would probably show up eventually. He couldn't imagine a husband letting his sweet wife go out alone at night like this. Maybe he didn't understand women very well. His past experiences with them had been disappointing and messy, so he couldn't really compare. Even though they had sat together several times now, they had only talked about the Immortal Hour. They were both so passionate about it. They never got past talking about the play and its music, singers, and Celtic stories. At the end of the night, she always gave him that enchanting smile, nodded, and then left. They hadn't really gone beyond their first meeting. "Hey," he said, almost blurting it out the next time he saw her. He had started sitting next to her as a habit now. "You could tell me your name."
Mines Mongi.
Christopher Monckton. Of course, she replied.
Mines Comfort.
Comfort. He thought it was a funny name, but it suited her somehow. Just Comfort? He asked, holding his breath. She laughed. Oh, there's Catherine as well, she said. I like that. It's pretty. They're sweet and pretty when said together. They're, well, very much like you. She laughed again. But they're not both like me, she said. I got the comfort part from George. To George? He asked, feeling unsure. He gave me the comfort. All I did was add the Catherine bit. Then you're married? Isn't everyone? Goodness, no, he cried. It's a horrible thing to be. It's dreadful. It's absurd, tying yourself to someone forever. Everyone. Certainly not. I'm not. Oh, but you're too young, she said, amused. Too young? And what about you? She looked at him quickly, a hint of doubt on her face. But the doubt turned into genuine surprise when she saw how serious he was. She had a triangular face, like a pansy, like a kitten, he thought. He wanted to stroke her. He was sure she was incredibly smooth and soft. And then there was George. Does your husband not like music? He asked, saying the first thing that came to mind, not really wanting to know what that blasted George liked or didn't like. She hesitated. I don't know, she said. He didn't used to. But he doesn't come here? How could he? She stopped, then added softly, the poor dear's passed away. His heart leaped. A widow. The awful war had done one good thing, at least. It had taken George away. I'm terribly sorry, he exclaimed earnestly, trying to look solemn. Oh, it's been a while, she said, bowing her head a little at the memory. It can't have been that long, he said. Why not? Because you haven't had enough time. She looked at him again, quickly, and saw nothing but honesty. Then she was quiet for a moment. She thought, this is rather nice, and a hint of a wistful smile appeared on her face. How old was he? 25 or 26 at most. Youth was such a lovely thing, so impulsive, so generous, and so sincere in its admirations and beliefs. He was a tall, loosely built young man, with fiery red hair, freckles, and long, skinny wrists that stuck out of his sleeves when he rested his head in his hands during the romantic scenes, gripping tighter and tighter as the love grew stronger. He had deep-set eyes, a beautifully shaped wide forehead, and a wide, kind mouth. He exuded youth, along with its frustrations, quick tempers, and even quicker appreciations. She stifled a small sigh and chuckled as she said, You've only seen me at night. Wait until you see me in the daylight. Will I ever get the chance? He asked eagerly. Don't you ever come to the daytime shows? She knew he didn't. Oh, daytime shows. No, I can't go to daytime shows. I have to work all week in my awful office, and on Saturdays, I play golf with an uncle who's supposed to leave me all his money. You should appreciate him.
Ido.
And I haven't minded until now. But it's a real hindrance when I want to do something else. He looked at her sadly. Then his face brightened. Sundays, he said eagerly. I'm free on Sundays. He's religious and won't play on Sundays. Could I? There are no daytime shows on Sunday, she said. No, but could I come and see you? Come and visit. Hush, she said, raising her hand as the music for the second act began. And just like before, at the end, before he could say anything, while he was still struggling with his coat, she slipped away as usual after nodding good night. The next time, however, he was more determined and started right away. It felt like he had been thinking about her nonstop, and it was silly not to know anything about someone he thought about so much, apart from her name and the fact that her husband was no longer alive. It was a big leap from knowing nothing at all, and the news of her husband's passing was such a relief to him that he couldn't help but feel like he might be falling in love. All husbands should be gone, he thought, troublesome, complicating things. What would have happened if her husband had still been alive? Well, he would have lost her right away, almost before getting started. And he was so lonely, and she was, well, what wasn't she? She was just like what he had been dreaming of for years, a little bundle of sweetness, warmth, comfort, reassurance, and love. The next time she came, as soon as she appeared, he went over to where she sat and started talking. He was going to ask her straight out if he could visit her, get her address, but she happened to be late that night. Just as he opened his mouth, the lights dimmed, and she raised her hand, saying, "Hush." Trying to whisper what he wanted to say was useless, because even the few audience members were strict about total silence. He also worried that she preferred the music over anything he might say. He sat with his arms crossed and waited. He had to wait until the end of the act, because even when the curtain fell between scenes and only the orchestra played, he was quickly shushed by the offended audience members when he tried to speak up again. She also raised her hand, saying, "Oh, hush." He started to feel a bit fed up with the immortal hour. But finally, the act ended and the lights came back on. She turned her flushed face to him, the music still gleaming in her eyes. She was always flushed and her eyes always sparkled at the end of the love scene. He couldn't help feeling very stirred up every time he saw the lovers' passionate embrace. Oh, to be embraced like that. He was yearning for love. "Isn't it wonderful?" she whispered. "Will you ever let me come and see you?" he asked, not wasting another moment. She looked at him for a moment, gathering her thoughts, a little surprised. "Of course," she said. "You can. Though." She paused. "Go on," he urged. "I was going to say, don't you already see me?" she said. "But what is this?" "Well, it's 2 or 3 times every week," she said. "Yes, but what is it?" "Just a casual meeting. You come. You happen to come, and then you disappear. Any time you might not come, and then..." Why then? She finished his sentence as he paused. You'd have all this beautiful music to yourself. I don't think they ever performed that last part more beautifully, do you? And she went on, chatting as usual about the immortal hour, and he didn't have a chance to say another word before the music started again, and the audience members collectively shushed everyone. Christopher thought enthusiasm should have its limits. He forgot that, to start with, his enthusiasm had far surpassed hers. He crossed his arms again, a sign of his determined and patient attitude. When the show was over and she bid him a smiling good night and hurried off without saying more, he wasted no time putting on his coat, but simply grabbed it and went after her. It was hard to keep up with her. She could slip through gaps he couldn't, and he almost lost her at the turn of the stairs. However, he caught up with her on the steps outside, just as she was about to go out into the rain, and he put his hand on her arm. She looked surprised as she glanced back. In the bright light from the theater, he noticed the weariness on her face. The music had tired her out. She looked exhausted. Listen, he said, don't leave like this. It's pouring. Wait here, and I'll get you a taxi. Oh, but I always take the tube, she said, holding on to him as some people pushed past and pushed her against him. You can't take the tube tonight. Not in this rain. And you look really tired. She looked at him oddly and chuckled. Do I? She said. Well, I'm not. Not at all tired. And I can definitely take the tube. It's very close. You can't do that. Stand here out of the rain while I get a taxi. And off he went. For a moment, she almost ran off herself, going to the tube as usual and getting home her own way. But then she thought, no, that would be wrong of me, very wrong. I must try to act like a gentleman. And waited. Where should I tell him to go? Christopher asked, having hailed a taxi and put her inside, yet not having the courage to insist on seeing her safely home. She gave him the address, 90A, Hertford Street, and he wondered why. Living in such a street with the air of Park Lane wafting down from around the corner, she didn't have a car and wanted to take the tube. Can I give you a lift? She asked, leaning forward at the last moment. He was in the taxi in an instant. I was hoping you'd say that, he said, closing the door so forcefully that raindrops splashed off the top of the window onto her dress. He had to wipe them off, which he did carefully, using a handkerchief that unfortunately wasn't one of his new ones. She sat quietly while he did it, going over the evening's performance, describing, reminding, and he, as he dried, told himself that he had had enough of the immortal hour. She must stop, she must stop. He needed to talk to her, find out more about her. He was eager to learn more about her before the taxi arrived at her home. And she did nothing but quote and express ecstasy as they bumped along. Ecstasy, he thought, pleased with the word that popped into his head. He liked it so much that he said it aloud. I wish she wouldn't be so ecstatic, he said. Not now. Not for the next few minutes. ECS. What? she repeated, puzzled. Aren't your shoes wet from crossing that soaking pavement? They must be wet, he said, reaching down to wipe their soles with his handkerchief. She watched him, a little surprised but still passive. This was what it meant to be young. One wasted a beautiful clean handkerchief on a woman's dirty shoes without a second thought. She noticed the thickness of his hair as he bent over her shoes. She had forgotten how thick young people's hair could be, having only looked at elderly heads for so long. To him, in the dimness of the taxi, she looked exactly like the dream, a warm, round, cozy, delightful dream lonely souls like himself always dreamed of, hugging their pillows sadly. As for her feet, he abruptly stopped drying them. The next thing he knew, he might be kneeling down and kissing them, and he was afraid she might not like that and get angry with him, never letting him see her again. "You've ruined your handkerchief," she remarked as he put it, all muddy, into his pocket. "I don't see it that way," he said, staring straight ahead out the front windows, sitting stiffly in his corner because he didn't trust himself and was afraid of not behaving. It was now clear to Christopher that he was deeply in love. He felt very happy about it because, for the first time, he was in love properly. All the other times had been so unpleasant, leaving him making wry faces. He had longed and longed to be in love, properly, with someone intelligent and educated as well as adorable. These three things, but being adorable was the most important. He stole a glance at her from the corners of his eyes. She didn't look tired anymore. How wonderful these dark taxis were if only the other person happened to be in love as well. Would she ever be? Would she ever be again? Or was all that buried with that scoundrel George? She had been fond of George. She had called him a poor darling. But it was easy to call the dead poor darlings and grow fond of them as time passed, since they had stopped being alive and bothersome. "Where should I drop you?" she asked. "We've passed it," he said. "At least, he hasn't gone anywhere near it. I live in Wyndham Place. I'll see you safely home and then take him on." "That's very kind of you, but you'll have to let me pay my share," she said. "And I say," he continued quickly, waving aside whatever she was doing with her purse impatiently, as they careened across Berkeley Square, and he knew time was short, "you haven't said if I may come and see you. I would really like to. There are so many things I want to hear you say. And we do nothing but talk about that darn immortal hour." "What? But I thought you loved it." "Of course, I love it, but it isn't everything. And we've talked about it enough, haven't we? Please let me come and see you. I'll be in London all next Sunday." They reached the bottom of Hertford Street, rushing along it. Even as he spoke, they arrived at 90A. With a screech of the brakes, the taxi stopped, a rough taxi, the roughest he had ever encountered. He might have had the luck to get one of those slow, careful old ones, driven by bearded old men who always came when he needed to catch a train or was late for a dinner. They would always pull back with old-fashioned politeness at every cross street, allowing even horse-drawn traffic to pass first. "Can I come next Sunday?" he asked, leaning across her to open the door, as she prepared to open it herself since he didn't move. "No, don't get out," he said quickly as she showed signs of getting out. "It's no use standing in the wet. Wait here while I go and ring." "But look, I have a latchkey," she said. "Besides, the night porter is there." Indeed, the night porter was there, and hearing the taxi stop, he opened the door at that moment. "And about Sunday?" Christopher persisted desperately as he helped her out. "Yes, do come and see me," she said, smiling up at him with her friendly, adorable smile, and his spirits soared. "Just not this Sunday," she added, and his spirits plummeted. "Why not this Sunday?" he asked. "I'll be free all day." "Yes, but I won't," she said, laughing, amused by him. "I'm sure there's something." She furrowed her brow, trying to remember. "Oh yes," she said, "Stephen. I've promised to go out with him." Stephen. His heart stopped. George was settled, completely, and now here was Stephen. Just as the door was about to shut on her, leaving him outside alone, understanding dawned on him. Stephen was her son, her little son, her only little son. As awful as it was to think about, marriage was truly horrible. George had left his mark, and this delicate, small thing, this exquisite, soft little creature, was the vessel for his foolish desire to continue his name. "I suppose," he said, stopping her, his hat still in his hand, rain falling on his bare head, the porter holding the door open and observing, "You're taking him to the zoo?" He couldn't think of a more likely place for Stephen on a Sunday than the zoo, and he would go there too, and take another look at those delightful monkeys. "The zoo?" she repeated, puzzled. Then she started laughing. "I wonder," she said, her face full of laughter, "why you think Stephen wants to go to the zoo? Poor darling, another poor darling, but this time a live one. He's as old as I am." As old as she was. "Stephen." She waved her hand. "Come another Sunday," she called out as the door closed. He stood for a moment, staring at it. Then he turned away slowly, putting on his hat as he descended the steps. Lost in painful thoughts, he mechanically headed home through the rain when the taxi driver, realizing with amazed indignation what his fare was doing, jerked him back to his obligations by vigorously and rudely honking.